Hello, everyone. I am Keith DeStone, and it's HeroesX office hours for v14 of HeroesX. And I'm here with Greg Nagy and Sarah and Jenna and Hélène, as always. And we are talking today about the Odyssey, the beginning of the Odyssey, or the beginning of our Odyssey into the Odyssey, which is another way of saying, a long way of saying hours 9 and 10. The hour 9 discussion question is particularly written in Greg's voice. When I was a PhD student at Harvard so many years ago, Greg says, I once heard something most striking from my old teacher, John H. Finley, who was a stellar professor of ancient Greek literature. Odysseus, he said in one of his lectures, gets a good press only in the Odyssey. Well, he was certainly right in implying that Odysseus gets bad press in ancient Greek traditions situated outside our Odyssey. That is to say, he is an incorrigible trickster, as anthropologists would say it, and he tends to violate social norms. Perhaps he can violate even moral norms. I cannot disagree with such formulations, but my question here is heading in a different direction. Can we say that Odysseus gets bad press even in our Odyssey?
Yeah, well, one participant thinks it's ambivalent. It's not quite right to call it bad press because Odysseus, after all, was the mastermind in winning the Trojan War. And isn't he truly sorry for all the suffering he inflicted?
I'm not sure he's truly sorry. That is to say, when he hears the sad song of the capture of Troy in Odyssey 8, I guess you could say that he connects with the suffering of the other side. But I'm not ready to say that he would say, I'm sorry. It's just that he gets really connected with the sorrow. But I guess my problem is the English language idiom, I'm sorry, where that is so tied to various different kinds of cultural values, even cultural preconceptions about what it is. So I'm sorry that I reacted in such a cavalier way to the wording of our participant. I would say, may I try it another way? I don't think he's sorry in the modern sense of American English colloquial uses of saying, I'm sorry. I think of Eric Siegel's wording in what used to be a popular novel and became a film. Love means never having to say you're sorry. Maybe I was influenced by that. I don't know.
How about regrets? Would you say that Odysseus has regrets? He would change the past if he could?
Much better, much better. And after all, Hélène would prefer the word regret, wouldn't you? Because when I think of how regret is used in French musical traditions, I'm thinking of Le Tombeau des Regrets, the Tomb of Regrets. Now we're cooking. Yes, regrets.
Quite right.
And dear Hélène, you might want to say more. Why should I represent your French heritage? You should represent it yourself.
Following on that, many participants talked about the scene where Odysseus is crying.
Yes.
And that reminded me the scene where Achilles is crying.
Yes.
Is there a way to compare tears of Achilles and tears of Odysseus?
Well, I go back to the beautiful book by Hélène Monsacré, Les larmes d'Achilles, the tears of Achilles, where she proves that the way men cry and the way women cry in Homeric narrative is differentiated. That men have one kind of physiology, women have another kind of physiology. And her point is that Achilles can go either way. That is to say, he is a virtuoso of lament. And by lament, I do mean crying while singing, singing while crying. And I think I would have said that Odysseus is not such a specialist in lament, but lately, when I look back at the first song of Demodocus in Odyssey 8, I'm starting to change my mind, because it turns out that when Odysseus is described as singing there, it's very, very, very complicated. And it looks as if he too is capable of expressing women's as well as men's conventions of lament. And I don't really say it in the Best of the Achaeans book, but I do say it in later work, especially, I would say, Homer the Classic and Homer the Pre-Classic. So I'm now thinking, yes, Odysseus too is portrayed as capable of a wide variety of laments. So he really does get reconnected to the sorrow and the pity of the Trojan War in Odyssey 8.
So thinking again back to the Iliad, and a number of people have been doing this, they're not just thinking, I know your question was about the Odyssey and the bad press, but it's also thinking, well, where else does he get bad press? And thinking back to the Iliad, there are places where he gets good press. He seems to fight well, he's respected, he's one of the prime wrestlers. So quite an, again, an ambivalent character.
Yes.
We see the shadow side of him, as somebody else has said, the downside of him, but also the plus side of him in both epics. Would that be fair?
It would be fair, but I would say I can think of one place in the Homeric Iliad where Odysseus gets bad press. I'm thinking of scroll 9, where Odysseus takes it upon himself to be the first reporter of what Agamemnon is offering to Achilles as compensation for having insulted him way back when in scroll 1. Rhapsody 1. Let's make it more performative and say Rhapsody 1, not scroll 1. Anyway, Odysseus speaks out of turn because the original arrangement had been for Phoenix, who is the nearest and dearest of the 3 ambassadors, to speak first. And Phoenix even gets the cue. Phoenix even gets the cue to speak first. But then Odysseus takes the initiative and speaks first instead. And then when Odysseus speaks, he doesn't report completely what the mindset of Agamemnon is in formulating the terms of compensation. Because in Agamemnon's mind, if Achilles accepts the compensation from Agamemnon, it means that Achilles is inferior to Agamemnon, that Achilles has to behave like a vassal, as some experts in Near Eastern traditions have pointed out. To be a vassal is to be a potential son-in-law to the overking. And I must say, I always thought, as the father of a daughter, that Agamemnon is such a good sport to say, I'll make things up to you. I'll let you marry one of my daughters. it's actually a very high-handed way of saying, I want you to be my vassal, because if you're my son-in-law, you'll be my subordinate. And that part of Agamemnon's deal, Odysseus does not report. So then I ask myself, what does Achilles refer to when he says, I hate more than the gates of Hades, when somebody does not say what somebody really thinks? That's definitely what Odysseus seems to have done. In other words, Odysseus, the way he formulated the terms of Agamemnon, seems to be undermining the heroic status of Achilles himself in Achilles' own epic, which is, of course, the Iliad. At least that's my argument.
Well, shall we go on to the next hour?
Yes. There's so much in these in these hours because Odysseus is such a complex character.
The hour 10 discussion question says, if you had to explain the relationship of nostos and nóos by way of only one single story, as retold in the Homeric Odyssey, for example, the Lotus Eaters, the Sirens, or one of the others, which would you choose and why?
Well, the nice thing is there's no single answer here, and as I'm sure we'll hear from our wonderful colleagues, the participants have a lot of latitude here, I think.
Yes, for one participant, it's the story of his adventures to the palace of Alcinous, and he thinks that he's finally is able to break free of the pattern, to really regain his nóos and have his successful nostos.
And he does. So I agree with the participant. That's a very successful set of events, because that's what does happen. Also, and I think this is the weirdest part of the adventure with the Phaeacians. He does become the most eligible husband for Nausicaa, even though he's so much older. And it's not so much that he's so attractive, it's that the Phaeacian youth, the young men who are eligible to marry Nausicaa, are all upstaged by Odysseus.
So Greg, if that had happened, would that then have effectively made him a vassal to Alcinous?
Yes, that's true. That's true. That's true. So I guess this is a way of having your cake and eating it too, is that he bests the young Phaeacians who are demonstrated to be inferior to him, even in the eyes of Nausicaa, but he avoids being a vassal to Alcinous. I like that. Very nice observation. How about some other scenarios? It's certainly not the only one. In my mind, not necessarily even the first one.
People pointed out the opposition, the name of Polyphemus, and losing his Metis. Also marking his name as no one.
Yes.
These are all about relationship between nóos and nostos.
Yes, yes. I would say that is an episode that's quite primal, isn't it? The symbolism, I'm going to use the word symbolism, just leaps at you. Yes. How about some more?
Another episode that has been picked out is the episode in Hades, and particularly the discussion with Achilles, that Achilles has a different relationship between the nostos and the nóos. He's certainly got nóos of some kind, but which would have been to his father's home, but he only had the either or choice, whereas Odysseus effectively manages to get both.
Yes, I quite agree. And you can say that this makes Odysseus a kind of double winner. He can have his cake and eat it too. I'll use that expression again, in the sense that he gets his epic, that's the kleos, but he also gets a safe homecoming, that's a nostos, which Achilles doesn't get. So it seems as if Achilles has to make a choice. Odysseus doesn't have to make a choice. The flip side, however, is that Odysseus cannot get primary credit for the capture of Troy, even though it's because of him and because of his meritus, his craftiness. It's because of that, those two factors, that the Achaeans succeed in capturing Troy. It's not because of Achilles' bie, that is to say, Achilles' military might. So in a sense, he loses the chance to be, may I put it this way, the star of the Iliad. He's not the star of the Iliad. Achilles is, even though Achilles is technically a failure if you measure success in terms of capturing Troy. If, however, you measure success in terms of who gets to be the #1 hero of the #1 epic, well, then it's Achilles who wins, even though he fails in participating in the capture of Troy. And it's Odysseus who loses, because let's face it, the Odyssey in terms of epic is secondary to the Iliad. I've now convinced myself over the years to think that the Odyssey would not be an epic if it weren't, shall we say, grafted onto the Homeric tradition. And how does that grafting happen? By being grafted to the Iliad. At one point, Keith had an essay where I think Keith actually used the term getting over it. And I must give Keith credit for that. I think there's an essay where I neglect to give Keith credit to your use of that wonderful expression. He's got to get over the Iliad.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's actually called Getting Over Odysseus.
There you go.
So it's also about Telemachus, is the main one who gets over Odysseus in my analysis. The things that I'm talking about, but Odysseus himself has to get over himself.
Yes. Also good. So in a sense, I didn't just lift something from Keith, but I think we should go back to that particular essay of mine and work on my acknowledging and referring to your use of the idiom getting over it. Okay, so let's do that.
I'll take it. Sure.
Okay.
I was going to say, I wonder if this relates in a way to something that someone else has been suggesting, which is there is, and it perhaps goes back to this almost a bad press here, because it's as if Odysseus almost sabotages his own efforts to go home. And is it part of that, trying to get back to Troy and not wanting to let it go? He does something, he forgets something, or he does something daring or bold. It's almost as if he kind of ruins his own homecoming, because he's not using his mind in the right way there. Exactly,
and you can trace that back to even the earliest episodes post Troy. I'm thinking, for example, of the adventure with the Kikones, which is like an invasion, except this invasion fails miserably. I think we could easily go through a whole series of adventures and see that kind of, how shall I call it, Iliadic relapses. He'll never be the star of an Iliad.
Oh, there's an episode that I find particularly puzzling in this regard, about the relationship between nostos and nóos. It's the one where Odysseus is asleep, totally asleep, but he's speeding directly home.
Yes.
It seems to me there's an inverse relationship between the amount of nostos he's getting and the amount of nóos he has.
That's true. He's out like a light. But then when he gets to Ithaca, he lights up because the morning star is rising, heralding the coming of the dawn. So in a sense, the sunrise and the awakening and the awareness are synchronized. But you're quite right, dear Keith. In a sense, the whole nostos is almost as if achieved for him by the Phaeacians. And that reminds me of something that I've been thinking about recently, again in Classical Inquiries that you valiantly edit, where I talk about how when he's competing with the arrogant young Phaeacian youth, these young men who you would think would be more eligible to marry Nausicaa than this middle-aged oldster Odysseus. At one point he says, well, I can't dance very well because I have sea legs. I've been a sailor so long and I just can't dance. And so basically then it's the Phaeacian youth who dance for him, because they're the ones who reenact in the second song of Demodocus the role of Hephaestus, the slow guy who catches up with the fast guy, who's Ares, the adulterous Ares. So you see what I'm saying? In a sense, the Phaeacians dance his role as the slow-footed analog of Hephaestus, as well as the role of their own role as the potential sexual partner of Aphrodite. So he's letting the Phaeacians dance for him. He doesn't have to dance. He's letting the Phaeacians sail for him because it's the Phaeacian ship that brings him to Ithaca. And then it's the Phaeacians, his rivals, who unload him from the boat. But you know, dear friends, I'm surprised that so far there's been no mention of maybe the most obvious and maybe the most easy to comprehend for its symbolism example of successful homecoming, where it's tied with consciousness. And may I just indulge myself and say it? How about the land of the lotus eaters, the island of the lotus eaters, where look, if you lose your nóos, you'll never get home, because you'll forget that, oh, my goal is to get home. If you forget that, then you just stay there and blank out. No nóos, no nostos. If you can't even think of home, why should you go home?
It's like a paradigmatic example.
Yes, yes.
Maybe it was too obvious for everyone.
Yes, but I like that kind of thing where we all have blind spots about sometimes the most obvious example. That happens to me all the time. That's also what happens when you're studying a complex character. There are so many examples you can use for any particular aspect of a very complex story. But but ultimately, there can be some very primal, simple things. And may I mention another one? To say it in a misleading way, how about to hell and back? That is to say, he goes to Hades, and then he comes back. And Hades itself is the realm of the unconscious. So there too, you have a kind of movement from nóos to nostos, or in this case, it's better put to say from nostos to nóos.
It's all over. The complex story has many sides.
Many sides, many sides. And what a delight. May I maybe bring this conversation to an end by saying that it cannot come to an end. And I quote again something that my beloved old professor John H. Finley said when he was asked, "Are you an Iliad person or are you an Odyssey person?" And he'd say, "It depends on which day it is."
Well, friends, participants, thanks again, and we'll leave you out there to the further wrangling over this complex story.
And wrangling about this is good. It's Odysseus is good to think with.